On a freezing night in the remote mountains of Maine, a widowed man heard scratching at his cabin door, and when he opened it, the last thing he expected was waiting on his porch. A wild bobcat stood there, her amber eyes burning with desperation. At her feet, two tiny kits, one limp, broken, barely clinging to life. Why would a fierce predator, an animal built on solitude and suspicion, place her young at the mercy of a human? What followed was a story of impossible trust, heartbreaking choices, and a bond that would defy the boundary between wildness and man. The northern woods of Maine held a silence that seemed older than time itself. Snow muffled the valleys, spruce trees stood shoulder to shoulder against the wind, and the mountains of Baxter State Park loomed like grey guardians above the endless forest. This was the place Samuel Whitaker had chosen to live out his later years, a cabin on the edge of wilderness where the only sounds were his own footsteps and the occasional cry of a raven cutting across the sky. Sam was 68, his back bent slightly from decades in the paper mill, his hands scarred by machines that no longer ran. The mill had closed years ago, leaving behind rust and memories. Not long after, his wife, Margaret, passed quietly after an illness that stretched too long. Town life, with its busy gossip and narrow streets, had become unbearable. Everywhere he turned, he saw echoes of what he'd lost. So he came here, to this wooden cabin tucked into the shadow of the mountains, to be alone but not lonely. Each day began the same way. Before dawn, he stirred the stove back to life, coaxing the coals until the flames whispered against the iron walls. He brewed coffee strong enough to fight the cold, poured it into his old enamel mug, and stepped out onto the porch. There he would stand, wrapped in a wool coat, steam rising from his cup, eyes sweeping across the clearing that opened into the dark fringe of forest. His Nikon camera rested on the railing, always within reach. The porch had become his church. From there, he witnessed the slow ceremonies of morning, deer emerging from shadow to paw at the snow, a moose lowering its head into the icy marsh beyond the ridge, fox tracks appearing where none had been the night before. The forest spoke through signs if you knew how to listen, and Sam had learned. After Margaret, after the mill, he needed something to keep him rooted. Photography became that tether. Through the lens he felt both the distance and the closeness of life he could no longer control. It was on one of those mornings, cold enough that the air nipped his skin, but calm enough that smoke rose straight from the chimney, that he first saw her. At the far edge of the clearing, where the spruce crowded thick, a shape unfolded from shadow. Low, deliberate, her coat mottled grey and tawny with the faint striping of a predator built for stealth. Tufts of black hair crowned her ears, and amber eyes scanned the clearing with wary intelligence. A bobcat. Sam froze, mug halfway to his lips. He had seen signs of bobcats before, faint prints, occasional scat, the disappearing blur of one crossing a road, but never like this, never so close, never when he had time to simply watch. His breath fogged in front of him as he lowered the cup and reached slowly for the Nikon. The shutter snapped once, a soft metallic crack in the silence. She lifted her head, ears twitching toward the sound. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked across the pale snow. Then, without panic, she turned. One fluid step, then another, and the trees closed around her again. Sam lowered the camera, pulse quickened, an unfamiliar warmth rising in his chest. In that fleeting moment, something stirred. An unexpected joy, sharp as the cold air, that reminded him the wilderness still held room for wonder. And so did he. 3 days passed before she came again, and by then, Sam had already begun watching for her without admitting it to himself. He told himself he rose earlier to catch the winter light, that the coffee tasted better when the stars still hung above the ridge. But the truth was in his body, the way his hands lingered on the camera strap, the way his gaze drifted toward the eastern spruce. On the fourth morning, there she was. Same stand of trees, same deliberate step, the same taut, wary beauty. She padded into the open, pausing to scan the air, ears twitching at every creak and flutter. Sam caught the click of the shutter in time, framing her profile as frost clung to her whiskers. She looked thinner than before. Even through the lens he could see the gauntness beneath her winter coat, the ribs faintly visible when she shifted. Sam knew what that meant. Hunting had grown harder as the season deepened. Snowshoe hares were scarcer this year, and competition from coyotes and foxes was fierce. The bobcat, young and likely still honing her skills, faced odds that even experience could not always tip. The wilderness offered no guarantees. He wrestled with himself for days, the first lesson of every ranger, every field guide: never interfere, never feed predators. Wild animals needed wild lives, but rules are easier to follow when your heart is not cracking at the sight of hunger. The decision came one evening when he found a deer carcass half buried in the drifts near the fence line, struck by a snowplow on the county road and scavenged by crows. Death had already claimed it. Sam cut away a modest portion, carried it to a flat rock at the clearing's edge, and left it there. He scuffed over his tracks on the way back, as though ashamed of his own compassion. For 3 mornings, nothing happened. The meat disappeared each time, likely dragged off by ravens or foxes. Then came the 5th morning. Sam was sipping coffee on the porch when the bobcat emerged. She paused, nose raised, catching the scent. Her body drew taut, as if caught between hunger and law. Slowly, cautiously, she circled the rock. 1 step closer, then another. At last she lowered her head, took a quick bite, retreated, waited. When nothing threatened, she returned and ate. Sam's heart thudded as he watched. He knew this moment was dangerous, not for his safety, but for the line between what should be and what was. Yet when she lifted her head and her eyes swept toward him, he felt not shame, but something stranger, the weight of being acknowledged. She had not fled, she had chosen to stay. He set boundaries for himself: never too much food, not every day, always far from the porch, so she would never tie her survival to his presence. He reminded himself she was not a pet, not a visitor, not something to be tamed. She was the forest itself, carrying her hunger and her wildness together. His role was not to change her, only to tip the scales enough to keep her alive through the hardest months. Patterns began to show. She came more often, usually at dawn, sometimes lingering afterward. She liked the hummock where the sun struck first, warming her sides before she retreated to the shadows. She flicked her ears sharply whenever ravens cawed, but ignored the chatter of red squirrels. Once, she even remained when Sam stepped softly onto the porch. The board creaked beneath his boot, and her eyes shot toward him. He froze, breath caught, but instead of vanishing, she held his gaze for a heartbeat, then turned calmly and melted back into the trees. That look followed him all day. It was not gratitude, animals don't barter in human currencies, but it was something close to recognition. And for Sam, who had lost so much to silence, the fact that any living creature might see him without fear or indifference carried a quiet power. The forest had offered him a neighbor, one who never spoke and never asked, but whose presence made the mornings fuller. A bond, fragile and distant, had begun. By January, the snow had become a second skin over the land, smoothing ridges, covering stumps, filling every hollow, until the forest seemed carved out of white stone. For Sam, the world was suddenly full of new signs. Every movement left its mark. Every life wrote itself across the blank page in delicate lines. The clearing in front of his cabin became a kind of ledger he checked each morning with the anticipation of a boy reading secret letters. That was when he saw them. 2 smaller sets of paw prints pressed beside the bobcats. At first, he thought they were rabbit tracks, but no, these were the same rounded pads, the same silent precision, only lighter, less steady, weaving close to the larger impressions. He crouched at the edge of the clearing, snow crunching beneath his knees, and stared until his breath smoked the air. She wasn't alone. She was a mother. The discovery stirred something fierce inside him. Against a winter that stripped even the strongest creatures, she carried 2 young ones with her. He imagined them, fur still soft with kitten down, eyes still wide with discovery, following her every move. They were alive in some hidden den beneath a root tangle or ledge, relying entirely on her. Sam's respect deepened. Survival had always been the law of this forest, but motherhood demanded even more: patience, cunning, endless courage. From then on, each time he saw her in the clearing, he looked harder for signs of the kits. Once, through his lens, he thought he caught a flicker of movement in the trees behind her, but when he focused, there was nothing but shadows. Another morning, the prints curved and tangled at the clearing's edge, as if the young had played there before, vanishing back into the dark. Then came the blizzard. It began with a hush, flakes sifting down like dust shaken from a curtain. By nightfall, the snow thickened, and by morning it howled against the cabin, hammering the roof and pushing white drifts against the door. For 3 days, the storm raged, shutting out the world beyond his windows. Sam kept the stove fed, drank his coffee, and listened to the roar, but his thoughts circled endlessly to the bobcat and her family. Were they sheltered? Had she found a hollow log or rock den deep enough to protect them from the wind's knife edge? He pictured her pressed tight around them, body shuddering against the cold, amber eyes wide and unblinking in the dark. When the storm broke, the silence was almost painful. Sam pulled on his boots and trudged out into a landscape transformed. The drifts reached his waist in places, and the trees bent low under the weight of snow. The clearing was untouched, an unbroken sheet. He scanned the edges, heart thumping as he searched for familiar signs. At last, he found them, her tracks, deep and steady, leading from the spruce to the flat rock, where he sometimes left scraps. Relief washed through him like warm water. She had survived the storm. But as he followed the trail back toward the forest, his chest tightened. There were no smaller prints beside hers. He stood for a long while in the cold, scanning the white for some trace he might have missed. Nothing. Just the clean, solitary line of her own survival. The forest keeps its secrets, he reminded himself. Perhaps she had left the kits hidden in the den. Perhaps the storm had separated them for a time. Yet doubt gnawed at him. The snow was honest, it told no comforting lies. That night, as the fire burned low, Sam found himself replaying the sight of those absent tracks. He had never held the kittens, never even seen them, yet their disappearance left a hollow in him, as though the storm had carved it straight out of his chest. He told himself not to imagine the worst. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw was a mother moving alone through the endless white, her paws writing a lonely story across the snow. Evenings in winter were quiet in Sam's cabin, so quiet he could hear the kettle ticking as it cooled on the stove, and the timbers creaking in protest against the cold. He had grown used to the hush, to the way the world seemed to fold into itself after dusk. Most nights he read by lamplight or edited photographs, sorting through images of deer at dawn or a hawk balanced on a fence post. It was a rhythm he trusted. That was why the sound startled him. At first it was faint, something brushing the boards of the porch like a branch dragged by wind. He paused, pen frozen above a notebook. Then came the second sound, sharper, deliberate, scratching. Not the skitter of a mouse or the busy digging of a squirrel, but a steady rasp that seemed to ask for his attention. Sam rose, slowly. His chair groaned as he pushed back, and he made his way to the door. Frost had thickened across the small window, but when he leaned close, the blur of a shape sent his pulse thudding. He wiped the glass with the sleeve of his flannel and froze. There on the porch stood the bobcat. Her coat was spattered with snow, each breath rising in quick bursts from her chest. She was closer than she had ever dared come, her paws planted on the wooden deck, just feet from where he stood. But it wasn't her nearness that stole his breath, it was what lay at her feet. Two small forms huddled against the boards. One stirred weakly, licking the face of the other. The second lay almost motionless, its back leg twisted at an angle that made Sam's stomach tighten. He could see the faint rise and fall of its chest, could see blood darkened into its fur. Sam's throat went dry. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, torn between awe and fear. Every instinct he knew about wild animals screamed that this was impossible. A bobcat mother hides her young, defends them ferociously, never brings them into the open, least of all to a human's doorstep. Yet here she was, amber eyes locked on his, as if presenting them to him, as if demanding something no words could carry. He unlatched the door slowly. The hinge creaked, and the sound made the mother flatten her ears. She stepped back a few paces, body taut, tail flicking. She didn't run, didn't vanish. Instead, she held her ground at the edge of the porch, pacing once, then fixing him with a stare that carried equal parts warning and plea. Sam crouched low. The air bit through his flannel, but he hardly noticed. He focused on the kits, on the fragile line of their lives drawn thin across the wooden boards. One was small but alert, nudging at its sibling with desperate insistence. The other barely moved, eyes squeezed shut, chest heaving shallowly. The sight pulled something raw from deep inside him. The mother gave a low growl, deep and tremulous, circling in agitation. But she didn't charge. She didn't snatch the injured one back into her jaws and retreat to the dark. She stayed, pacing, waiting, trusting in some way that defied reason. Sam's heart hammered. He thought of Margaret, of the nights he had sat helpless at her bedside, wishing for some miracle to ease her pain. Now another life was placed before him, smaller but no less sacred, and this time, unbelievably, he was the one asked to act. He whispered, "What do you want me to do?" Though the answer was plain. The kit whimpered softly, barely audible over the rasp of the wind. Sam felt tears sting his eyes. His hands shook as he reached out, not yet touching, just letting the towel he carried fall close enough for the mother to see. She growled again, but softer, a sound that carried torment more than threat. For a long moment, man and bobcat stared across the narrow porch, two creatures bound by the same truth. A life hung between them, and the choice lay here, now. Sam swallowed hard. He knew stepping forward could end with claws, with teeth, with blood. But he also knew the weight of those eyes on him, the way they burned not with hatred, but with desperate appeal. The wild had bent its law for him. He couldn't refuse. Sam's pulse rattled in his ears as he backed into the cabin and fumbled for his phone. The numbers blurred for a moment before he steadied his hands enough to dial. When Dr. Elaine Foster's voice answered, a calm, professional tone sharpened with curiosity, he nearly sagged with relief. He explained in quick, uneven words. The mother bobcat, the kits, the one injured, the way she had carried them onto his porch as if demanding his help. There was a pause. Then Elaine said, "Sam, this is unheard of, but if she's still there, she's giving you a chance. Move slowly, use gloves, use a towel, and if you have a carrier, anything that can keep the kit safe, bring it inside. Do not push her. Let her see what you're doing." Sam grabbed what he had: thick leather work gloves, an old wool towel, and the dented metal pet carrier that had once belonged to Margaret's cats. His breath came fast and shallow, his body trembling with the weight of what he was about to attempt. Before stepping outside again, he sliced a small piece of venison from the freezer and placed it on a plate. When he opened the door, the mother snapped her head toward him, ears flat, eyes blazing. He set the food at the far edge of the porch and stepped back. She watched, every muscle tight, but didn't move toward it. Her focus remained on the injured kit. Sam lowered himself slowly, the towels spread in his gloved hands. The healthy kit squeaked and scrambled back against the boards, but the injured one barely stirred. Sam's chest clenched as he saw its twisted leg, the matted fur dark with dried blood. The mother growled low, pacing just beyond arm's reach. Sam forced himself to breathe evenly to keep his movements steady. "Easy," he whispered, the word more for himself than for her. He slid the towel beneath the little body, careful not to jolt the broken limb. The kit whimpered once, weak and thin, then stilled. The sound that came from the mother then was like nothing Sam had ever heard. It was not a roar, not a warning. It was a broken, choking cry that rose from deep in her chest, a sound of anguish that rooted him to the spot. But still she didn't strike. She watched, tail lashing, torn between instinct to protect and the impossible choice of surrender. Sam lifted the kit gently, the bundle light as air, and placed it inside the carrier. He latched the door with trembling fingers, the click loud in the frozen silence. The mother stepped forward 2 paces, muscles quivering, then stopped. Her eyes locked on the carrier, then on him, as though measuring whether she had made a mistake. Sam stood, chest heaving, and backed toward the cabin door. Each step felt like a lifetime. The healthy kit mewed behind him, pawing weakly at the boards, but the mother moved to it quickly, gathering it against her side. She made no move toward Sam, no attempt to reclaim the injured one. She only stood there, amber gaze fixed on the door as he disappeared inside. Moments later, Sam was in his truck. He set the carrier on the passenger seat, strapped it down with trembling hands. Snow clung to the windshield, and the back roads were little more than rutted ice, but he drove anyway. 2 hours to Bangor, 2 hours with his knuckles white on the wheel, glancing again and again at the small form breathing shallowly in the towel. The mother's last cry echoed in his ears the whole way. The Bangor Wildlife Rehabilitation Center glowed with sterile light when Sam pulled into its icy lot. He carried the crate through double doors where 2 technicians were already waiting, summoned by Dr. Foster's urgent call. They took the bundle quickly, their practiced hands steady where his had trembled. Sam stood frozen as the carrier vanished down a hall, the door swinging shut behind them. For the first time since the bobcat had appeared on his porch, he felt the true weight of what had happened. A wild mother had entrusted him with her child, and he had no power left but to wait. The hours dragged. He sat in a plastic chair that smelled faintly of disinfectant, staring at a poster of owls on the wall. Every few minutes, he replayed the porch scene in his mind, the mother's anguished cry, the kit's limp body, the impossible decision. He rubbed his palms together, fighting the cold that seemed to have sunk into him for good. At last, Dr. Foster emerged. Her face carried exhaustion, but not defeat. "He's alive," she said. Sam exhaled so sharply it was almost a sob. "Compound fracture of the tibia and fibula. Severe hypothermia, malnourished, but he's stronger than he looks. We've set the leg, given fluids, started antibiotics. It's going to be a long recovery, but he has a chance." She cautioned him that survival was not the only question. Even if he heals, his time here will change him. At this age, with this much human intervention, returning to the wild may not be possible. "We'll try, of course, but you should be prepared." Sam nodded numbly. He had promised nothing to anyone but himself, yet the words struck him like a broken vow. What would the mother think if her kit never returned? He pictured her pacing the tree line, waiting, amber eyes cutting the shadows. He had saved the life, perhaps, but altered its course forever. In the weeks that followed, Sam returned often. The staff knew him by name, smiled when he walked in with his wool cap pulled low. They allowed him to watch through glass as the little bobcat, male, 3 months old, barely larger than a house cat, struggled through his treatments. His fur was a smoky grey streaked with faint spots, his ears too large for his head. Sam, against his better judgment, began to call him Ash. Ash grew stronger by degrees. His cast held his leg straight as he learned to put weight on it. His ribs softened as he ate the carefully measured meals the staff prepared. Meat delivered with long-handled tools so he wouldn't associate food with people. They worked hard to limit human contact, masks, minimal handling, wild sounds piped into the enclosures, but even so, Ash's eyes lingered longer on humans than they should have. He didn't bolt at their shadows. He didn't hiss when he caught their scent. Sam saw it too. Each visit filled him with relief at the kit's survival and unease at what that survival meant. Ash no longer looked like a creature destined for the forest. His gaze, bright and curious, followed Sam when he appeared at the observation window. Once, when Ash limped to the edge of his enclosure, their eyes met through the glass, and Sam felt the same jolt he had felt on the porch that night, only now it came from the son, not the mother. He drove home each time with a hollowness inside him. He had become part of this story, whether he wanted to or not. The mother had placed her trust in him, and now he was carrying it forward into choices she would never understand. The question gnawed at him on those long drives through snow-bound roads. Had he saved her kit, or had he stolen him from her world forever? By the time March softened the edges of the snowbanks, Ash was walking on his mended leg, with only a faint limp. His body had filled out, his coat thickened, and his eyes burned with youthful curiosity. Yet the verdict from the experts was unanimous. He would never return to the wild. Months of treatment, daily handling, the sheer intensity of human involvement had dulled the essential fear a bobcat needed to survive. Release him, and he would linger too close to houses, too trusting, too vulnerable. Sam listened to the decision with a heavy stillness. The veterinarians spoke kindly, but their words carried the finality of a door closing. He nodded, though inside he felt a gnawing ache. He remembered the promise he had whispered to the mother as he carried her injured kit away. "I'll bring him back." Now he knew that promise had been broken, though not by choice. Still there were other paths, Under Dr. Foster's guidance, Sam applied for a special home care license, one that would allow him to take responsibility for Ash's lifelong care in a controlled environment. It wasn't simple. Inspectors visited the cabin, paperwork piled on his kitchen table. He took courses online about nutrition, enrichment, and safety, and when approval finally came, he set about building something on his land he never could have imagined months before, a permanent enclosure. Neighbors might have called it extravagant, a high, secure fence circling a plot of land larger than his own yard, with logs dragged in for climbing, rocks for hiding, and even a small man-made stream fed by a pump. To Sam, it was less a cage than a promise kept in a new shape. A place where Ash could live as close to wild as possible, safe yet still touched by the forest. Meanwhile, the mother bobcat still appeared. Sam would spot her at the tree line some evenings, her silhouette frozen against the snow, watching. Sometimes she circled the clearing, sometimes she lingered long enough to loose a low, haunting call into the night. Each time, Sam felt it like a tug in his chest. She was searching, waiting, asking, and though he had no language to answer, he whispered into the dark anyway, telling her the truth as gently as he could. He's alive, he's healing, I'll keep him safe. The day Ash came back to the mountain felt both like a beginning and an ending. Sam rose before dawn, unable to sit still, pacing the porch with coffee cooling in his hands. He had checked the enclosure a dozen times the night before, running his palm along the fence line, testing the locks, listening to the trickle of water in the little stream he'd built from a pump and stone. Everything was ready, yet he felt as nervous as if he were about to welcome a child home. When the transport van pulled into the drive, Sam's chest tightened. 2 technicians stepped out, careful and brisk, carrying the crate that held the young bobcat. Ash was bigger now, nearly 6 months old, his smoky coat thick and healthy, his ears pricked with restless energy. Even through the slats of the carrier, his amber eyes darted, absorbing everything. They carried the crate to the enclosure and set it inside the sheltered corner. Sam stood a few paces back as Dr. Foster unlatched the door. For a long moment nothing happened. Ash crouched at the threshold, nose twitching, body taut with suspicion. Then, with the sudden grace of his kind, he leapt forward. The first thing he did was test the ground, claws scraping against the frozen earth. Then he padded toward the logs, climbing halfway before jumping down, circling, sniffing. He stopped at the stream, dipped one paw into the running water, startled back, then tried again, paw batting at the flow like a playful kitten. Sam watched from outside the fence, hands gripping the posts. Relief and grief mingled in him, leaving his throat tight. Ash was home, yet not the home nature had intended. He was safe. But safety came at the cost of freedom. Sam told himself this was the best compromise the world allowed. The mother's trust had not been betrayed. It had simply been reshaped. As dusk settled and the first stars opened in the sky, Ash curled under a pine bough in the corner of his new territory. Sam lingered, leaning on the fence until the dark closed in. He whispered good night into the still air, hoping somehow the sound would reach both Ash inside the enclosure and the mother who still haunted the tree line. It was nearly 2 weeks before Sam saw her again. The March snow had begun to crust and sink, and the forest carried that faint smell of thaw when the bobcat mother reappeared. He was on the porch at dusk, camera idle in his lap, when movement rippled at the tree line. She stepped out, lean but steady, her coat darkened by months of winter. Sam's breath caught. He thought she might linger at the clearing as she once did, scanning for scraps or scents. Instead, her gaze went straight to the new structure, the enclosure. With cautious steps, she circled its perimeter, silent as smoke slipping along the mesh. Ash had been napping under a pine bough, but the moment her scent reached him, he rose. Sam gripped the fence post, heart hammering. Ash padded toward the mesh, head low, ears perked, moving with a mixture of excitement and hesitation. Then he saw her. The moment froze, the young bobcat inside the enclosure, the mother outside, their amber eyes locking through the barrier. They did not touch, not really. A fence of steel wires separated them, but they stood still, mirrored as though nothing else in the world existed. The mother's tail twitched once. Ash pressed closer, nose nearly against the mesh, and gave a low, throaty sound halfway between a chirp and a purr. Sam's eyes stung. He had imagined this moment in countless ways, but the reality was quieter, more sacred. No desperate clawing at the fence, no frantic attempt to reunite. Just recognition, long and unbroken. It lasted minutes, maybe longer, until the mother finally sat, still facing her son, and Ash sank down to mirror her posture. Dusk deepened into night before she rose. She gave one lingering look, then slipped back into the dark forest. Sam remained at the fence long after both bobcats had vanished from view, one into the trees, the other into the shadows of his new home, feeling the weight and wonder of what had just passed between them. The promise he thought he had broken now felt differently kept. Spring melted into summer, then slid quietly toward another winter. The rhythms of the forest shifted, yet one truth remained. The mother bobcat did not disappear. She no longer came every week, no longer paced with the restless urgency of those first visits, but the trail cameras told the story. Time and again her shape appeared at the margins of the property, sometimes at dawn, sometimes beneath a swollen moon, her amber eyes reflecting in the dark as she paused near the enclosure. Ash grew taller, his youthful awkwardness giving way to the lean muscle of adulthood. He moved with the grace of his kind, climbing logs, padding through the shallow stream, staking out corners of his small domain as though it were a kingdom. And though he had learned to live within fences, some piece of the wild still pulsed in him. When his mother appeared, he would rise, ears pricked, and wait at the mesh. Their reunions were silent but sure, recognition flowing across the barrier like an invisible current. For Sam, those moments became the measure of everything. He had not returned the kit to the wilderness, not in the way he once dreamed, but he had not severed the bond either. He had built a bridge, fragile yet enduring, between the raw world beyond his porch and the fragile world of human compassion. One evening, as snow dusted the ground again, he spotted her with another kit at her side. She paused at the clearing, letting the youngster watch Ash from a distance before disappearing into the trees. Sam felt a deep ache ease in his chest. He had not broken his promise, he had reshaped it. And in that reshaping lay something rare, a trust freely given by the wild, and a life lived as its keeper.